Welcome to Fear the Old Lore, where we examine the English and Japanese versions of Bloodborne to gain a better understanding of the lore. Last time we focused on the Old Blood and its connections to the dead. In this episode, we will turn our attention to the Vilebloods of Cainhurst and what makes their blood so vile. One of the most significant thematic changes in the localization of Bloodborne comes from how references to blood were handled. It's a little difficult to explain, but generally speaking, in English it's made to sound like there's different kinds of blood, and it's strongly reinforced in characters like Alfred's dialogue. When he introduces himself, he claims he's a hunter of Vilebloods, and when he bids farewell, he says, "May the good blood guide your way." Naturally, if there's good blood and vile blood, it makes it sound as though there's more than one kind of blood. The truth is, there isn't a difference in the kind of blood used between the Healing Church and the Vilebloods. The difference comes from the purity of it, and the more vile it is, the more potent it becomes. Vileblood doesn't exist in the Japanese script. Instead, they're called Kegare Explained, or the Impure Blood Clan. Calling them Vilebloods is a good localization in that it conveys there's something profane about their blood, but it's used too often and puts too much emphasis on Cainhurst as a clan, rather than the quality of their blood. The translators aren't entirely to blame, though. No matter what they could have chosen, it wouldn't have been able to convey the full cultural context of how and why the Vileblood's blood is vile. The Kegare portion of Kegare Explained comes from Kegare. It means something that's impure, unclean, or defiled. It has strong affiliations with death and decomposition, like blood, menstruation, childbirth, disease, and eating unclean animals, but it's also more broadly related to calamity, disorder, and disasters like floods and earthquakes. In many ways, Kegare is similar to the Judeo-Christian concept of sin, but it's not as concerned with guilt or moral judgment. Instead, it focuses more on physical and spiritual purity as it relates to death and filth. For example, killing a person and coming into contact with their dead body wouldn't be as impure as coming into contact with a diseased person's corpse or the corpse of an animal that's been left out in the open. Kegare is contagious, and contact with impurity can make someone impure by proxy, though one's actions could also cause them to become impure. Jealousy, contempt, avoiding one's responsibilities, and other negative behavior could be a sign of someone who has been influenced by impurity, or one who has an impure heart. Those afflicted by it have a more difficult time fitting into society, and some believe that the term Kegare is related to Kegare as in Kigakareru, which essentially means to wither one's spirit or energy. In other words, impurity can cause people to become drained of their vitality, have negative thoughts, and lack the energy and drive for daily life. From a broader perspective, it's easy to see how people could associate the depressed or sullen moods of the bereaved on the impurity produced from death. Because of its association with death, blood was regarded as very impure, and contact with it was considered taboo. By the same token, women were considered impure from menstruation and childbirth, and they were often forbidden from visiting shrines or participating in certain events for fear their residual impurity would anger the kami. Angering a kami was thought to be capable of bringing personal or even national calamity as a form of divine punishment. Earthquakes, droughts, tsunamis, natural disasters, and even imperial curses were often attributed to angering kami. Thus, it was extremely important for those who came into contact with Kegare to avoid spreading it to others. Kegare isn't as provocative today as it once was, but it still holds these cultural connotations that can't be simply translated. It's meant to link the blood to the profane, and drinking it akin to blasphemy. Vile blood doesn't do a bad job capturing that the blood is impure, but it ends up inadvertently muddying the lore by being used too often in places it doesn't belong. As I mentioned before, Vileblood doesn't exist in the Japanese script. Instead, they're called the Ketsuzoku, which means blood clan or blood relatives. While they are occasionally referred to as the Kegare Ketsuzoku, or the Impure Blood Clan, it only appears in dialogue and descriptions relating to the Healing Church. They're not meant to be mutually exclusive. One of the issues in using Vileblood so heavily is that it whitewashes the relationship between Queen Annalise of Cainhurst and Queen Yharnam of Thumaru, and the role of blood dregs in creating them. Rather than being called the Queen of Vilebloods, Annalise is called Cainhurst no Chi no Jo, or the Blood Queen of Cainhurst. It might seem like nitpicking at first, but it becomes relevant when we compare it to Queen Yharnam's trophy description. Just as Annalise is the Blood Queen of Cainhurst, Yharnam is the Blood Queen of the Old Labyrinth. It's meant to have been a definitive link between the two, but ended up being mostly lost in translation. A trace of it remains in the queenly flesh, which calls her the Blood Queen of Cainhurst, but it's easily missed, especially since its quick description calls her the Vileblood Queen, even though they have identical source text. Because Yharnam and Annalise share the title of Blood Queen, it could imply there are other similarities shared in between them, and we may be able to gain a better understanding of Thumaru by looking at Cainhurst and vice versa. When the hunter swears the blood oath to Queen Annalise and becomes a Vileblood, they're given the Kegare rune. It allows the hunter to obtain blood dregs that can be offered to Queen Annalise for minor rewards and the opportunity to partake in her blood. Blood dregs, or Chino Kegare, are blood impurities. They're what makes the Vileblood vile. Blood impurities are sought by the blood hunters of Cainhurst blood clan and are found within echo fiends, also known as hunters. The impurities are offered to Queen Annalise with the hope that one day she will embrace a child of blood in her arms. It's a practice that may have originated in Thumaru and mirrors what's described in the Blood Rapture rune. Blood Rapture is the raw euphoria of the warmth of blood. Restores HP with visceral attacks, one of the darker hunter techniques. This rune resonates with the servants of the queen, carrier of the child of blood, who yearn for their queen's blood with little hope of requitement. For them, they find solace in Blood Rapture that serves as a surrogate for their desires. There are some issues with the text, though. It may sound odd that the queen's servants yearn for her blood with little hope of requitement, since Annalise rewards the hunter with her blood. The Japanese version of the Blood Rapture rune doesn't have this line, and there are a number of small differences worth examining. Here's a more literal translation of it. One of the Carol runes of a phonetic transcription of an inhuman voice. Blood Rapture may be as though discovering the joy of life and the warmth of blood. One of the dark aspects of hunters restores HP from inner organ strikes. This secret rune is furthermore communicated to those serving the queen holding a child of blood. To those who yearn for the queen's blood, they find the reward in Blood Rapture. The first notable difference is the Japanese description has 2 paragraphs, whereas the English has 3. The portion about having little hope of requitement is missing. The second difference is that the queen is called the carrier of the child of blood. While being a carrier of a child is semantically close to holding or embracing one, part of the reason I'm stressing this point is all references to bearing a child of blood in Japanese were altered to holding or embracing them instead. This information, in conjunction with the other differences in the description, leads me to believe the English may have been based on an earlier draft. The current description is much clearer in that those who serve the queen are rewarded in Blood Rapture, which comes from a high on life found in the warmth of blood. This warmth matches how Annalise says we will feel the spreading corruption burn when taking her blood. The Blood Rapture rune can be obtained from killing the Shadows of Yharnam and the Bloody Crow of Cainhurst. Admittedly, there's very little information about the Bloody Crow and his ties to the Vilebloods, but it reinforces thematic connections between Yharnam and Annalise's Blood Queens. Since Queen Annalise rewards servants who offer her blood dregs with her blood, we can infer the same of Queen Yharnam. If it's true that Queen Yharnam also imbibed blood dregs, it would imply the Yharnam stone she carries was a child of blood. The Ring of Betrothal, which Queen Yharnam also wears, supports this reading, as it says, wedlock was a blood contract only permitted to those slated to bear a special child. Queen Annalise also seems to recognize the significance of the Ring of Betrothal. Propose to her and she will refuse, stating, such a path would be like lead to further ruin. It's uncertain how much she knows about the ring, but considering her other connections to Queen Yharnam, it wouldn't be surprising if she knew the circumstances surrounding the Thumerian monarch and her child of blood. If marriage and a child of blood are connected to ruin, it's unclear why Annalise would continue to take blood dregs, yet refuse marriage. Perhaps she really does want to spare the hunter from a horrific future. Bearing in mind that blood dregs are literal impurities in blood, the more impure one's blood becomes, the closer it brings them to great ones. This relationship is made explicit through multiple sources. In my previous video about Old Blood, I explained how the power of the blood comes from blood echoes, which are synonymous with the spirits and the wills of the dead. With blood tied to death, and death being Kegare, it works on multiple levels that blood dregs are produced from large quantities of blood echoes, and that the cold blood with the most blood echoes is Great One Cold Blood. As the blood becomes concentrated with echoes, it begins to take on cosmically nightmarish properties similar to the Great Ones, and the impurities within it can be used to produce a Great One infant, a child of blood. Ariana's third umbilical cord reveals it was corrupted blood that began this Eldritch liaison with the formless Great One Erden. From her attire, we can infer that Ariana is descended from the nobility of Cainhurst, making her blood more vile than that of the healing churches. Her blood file reaffirms this, stating, "Her blood is similar indeed to precisely what was once forbidden." Despite being a member of the healing church, Adela is jealous of Ariana, a prostitute, for having higher quality blood than she does. We know Ariana's blood is of a higher quality than Adela's because the impurities within it are what allow for an Eldritch liaison with the formless Great One Erden. Since Adela doesn't have a child with Erden, it proves the blood of the healing church isn't as potent as Cainhurst's, and it may be the reason why the healing church made it forbidden. Alfred says Vilebloods threaten the purity of the healing church's blood healing, by which he means they threaten the healing church's ability to control it. If the Vileblood's blood was more potent or holier than that of the healing churches, their existence alone would be a threat to the church and undermine their religious authority. It's unknown whether Cainhurst held sovereignty over Yharnam when it happened, but the raid on it may have been conducted so the healing church can consolidate control over Yharnam for themselves. Another possibility is the raid on Cainhurst could have been the result of conflict sustained over a period of time. Gehrman mentions the ministers of the church were originally the guardians of hunters in the time of the hunter Ludwig, yet the blood hunters of Cainhurst collect blood dregs which come from hunters. If Cainhurst was actively trying to obtain blood dregs from hunters, and the healing church was acting as their guardians, the two groups would have clashed. A final possibility is the healing church may have used the raid to kidnap a child of blood from Annalise. There's not enough information to confirm or deny it, but it's possible this was intended at one point in development, but may have been retconned later. In the unpatched version of the game, the third umbilical cord found in the abandoned old workshop said it originated in the child of the Vilebloods. It was changed in subsequent patches, making it less clear whether Annalise had a child of blood at all, much less whether one was taken from her. No matter the case, Alfred is a victim of healing church propaganda, making him an unreliable source of information about it. We'll probably never know the full story. What we do know is impurities within blood lead to liaison with Great Ones, and Vilebloods gather them for their queen so she may have a child of blood. Infants and blood seem to have been subject to study for some time. In Byrgenwerth and the lecture hall, there are numerous infant experiments left behind in cages for students to examine. When looking at them closely, they appear to have tiny skulls in their heads. These skulls might relate to the spirits of the dead within Old Blood, or the skulls that appear in Ritual Blood. It shows that death is in the blood, and may have an adverse effect on developing fetuses. One question this raises is whether the infants were stillborn, or if they were taken from their mothers before they were born. The existence of red jellies in Bastards of Loran suggests it isn't unusual for infants to be stillborn due to the blood. They were inspired by real-life phenomena, as game director Hidetaka Miyazaki mentions in an interview with Future Press, that the more advanced a society or an organism becomes, the more its birth rate declines. It's why great ones lose their children. An unforeseen consequence of the blood-lifting people beyond the bounds of man could be the inability to produce children, leading to the stillbirth seen in Red Jellies, the Bastards of Lorraine, and the infant experiments of Byrgenwerth. A few questions this raises is how then can Yharnam or Annalise have a child of blood, and why do they not turn into beasts? There are no definitive answers, but it seems likely that the impurity within them elevates them beyond man and stifles beasthood. Excluding bosses, there are no beast-type enemies in the Thumerian Chalice dungeons, and Cainhurst also lacks beasts, even though the bloodsuckers and lost children of antiquity resemble them. Impurity in the form of blood dregs can grant insight which reduces beasthood, yet they can also be given to Queen Annalise. Offering blood dregs to Annalise causes her to share her impure blood with her servants, which in turn causes their blood to become more impure in a form of literal trickle-down economics. When the servants of Cainhurst and Thumeru offer dregs to their monarchs, they lift their entire civilization, which could explain why so few of them succumb to beasthood. Thumerians and Vilebloods resemble traditional undead creatures with gaunt, pallid skin and sunken-in eyes. Their appearances might be attributable to the blood they consume. With the power of the blood coming from the dead, it might cause those who imbibe large quantities of it to become altered and take on the characteristics of the dead themselves. Thumerians resemble messengers, and a number of spectral enemies like the Boundwoman of Cainhurst and evil labyrinth spirits of Thumeru may be further evidence of the blood turning people undead. Hitting these spectral enemies produces a unique sound, and instead of blood, they bleed a kind of black mist. This black mist can be found in Wandering Nightmares, Mad Ones, and even Murgo's Wet Nurse. that's likely tied directly to the nightmare and can even be seen seeping out of the ground in the Nightmare of Mensis. The common thread between all these enemies is that they seem to exist beyond the planes of reality and are sustained by the nightmare, which serves as a kind of afterlife in Bloodborne. The power of the nightmare can be used to transcend death, and the blood is connected to it. Whenever a wandering nightmare is killed, it will drop either a bloodstone shard or a gem, showing that blood exists at the core of these beings, and potentially the nightmares as well. The Bell Maidens in Yahar'gul use a similar black mist to reanimate Yharnamites from pools of blood. When they're killed, the mist will explode out of the Yharnamites they raised, making them mortal once again. While Murgo's wet nurse might not be undead, it is a great one, and killing it makes the Nightmare Slain text appear. The same is true for both the Moon Presence and the Orphan of Kos, however neither bleed the same mist as Murgo's wet nurse. Instead, the Moon Presence is able to manipulate blood and what looks like the white mist of blood echoes into a nightmarish black mist and vice versa. When it regenerates its limbs, they become cloaked in the nightmare mist, suggesting that as a nightmare great one, its body is indeed composed of the nightmare. Killing the Orphan of Kos and destroying its body will make the prey slaughtered text appear on screen, and its true form will appear as a wispy black sprite attached to the side of the corpse of Mother Kos. Striking it will cause it to dissipate, and the Nightmare Slain text will appear on screen. It shows that even though the orphan is dead, its consciousness can persist in sleep or dreams, much like the Yharnam Stone. Even though the Yharnam Stone may be stillborn or an ectopic pregnancy, the fact that the nightmare can transcend death and allow a Great One's consciousness to persist may imply that the infant within it isn't truly dead. It's unclear if the Nightmare Slain text means the Great Ones we've killed are permanently destroyed, but if they're anything like the Orphan of Kos, their consciousness may return to the bottomless cosmic ocean of the nightmares, accepting of all there is and can be. To summarize, the reason the Vileblood's blood is vile is due to the blood's association with death and Kegare. As their blood becomes more and more impure, it causes them to become closer to the Great Ones. The servants of Cainhurst and Thumuru gather impurity in the form of blood dregs and offer it to their queens so they may produce a Great One infant, a child of blood. Since the impurities within blood dregs are linked to insight, it may have a role in allowing infants to transcend the bounds of man. Despite this, there is still the danger a woman could transform into something inhuman, or that her child may be stillborn as it's evolved beyond humanity. Additionally, it may require a staggering amount of impurities to allow a woman to have a proper child of blood and the combined forces of an entire country funneling them to her. One of the more interesting implications of this information is that it could imply the power of Great Ones comes from the dead. While the nature of certain Great Ones like Erden is enigmatic, they may have come from children of blood or transformed from humans. Regardless of their origin, it's interesting that the divinity associated with blood and Great Ones is a direct result of impurity, and makes me wonder if the Great Ones should be considered evil by extension, but that might be worth exploring more another time. For now, thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking it or subscribing to my channel, where I intend to release more Bloodborne related content in the future. Fear the old lore.